What's up? Already applause. I love it. It's such a welcoming audience. How many of you were here last year? Okay, here's the lesson I learned. You know, I came in last year, I was asked to speak about the future of women, and I didn't do that because as I shared last year, I was going through a health situation where it was, there was a slight possibility. I didn't believe it was a real possibility, but there was a 20% chance that the speech I was going to give to you might be my last speech. And so I dropped out of my head and I dropped into my heart and my guts, and I delivered a talk like I've never delivered before. And you delivered for each other an experience like you've probably never had before. It's probably why we're full up to the gills, and either I'm having my own personal summer or we are generating so much energy in here. So for those of you who were here last year, I remember that gal who was sitting over there, and she was, one of my life lessons was, when given a choice, choose the bigger life. And there was a woman sitting over there who had the opportunity to go to Scotland. And kind of like as a group, we were like, girl, go to Scotland, right? And there were some women whom I met afterwards, we all queued up and talked with each other here, who had gone through such pain and were sharing their own stories. And there were a lot of women and men in the audience last year, many, many, many of whom were new to the region. So this is just a show of hands. But we know that North Carolina is on track from being the 12th most populous state in the country to being the 8th most populous state in the country. And a lot of that growth is happening in Western North Carolina. So quick show of hands. How many of you are here new within the last 5 years? 5 years. Okay. How many of you are new within the last 3 years? Hand up. Okay, here's your assignment, everybody else. Love these women up. Get them connected, okay? Help them put down their roots here. So the big lesson from last year is, if you don't deliver the talk that you told Leanne you were gonna deliver, you have to come back and do a do-over. So that's why I'm here this year, to sort of do a do-over. In lieu of talking into microphones later, I'm just going to give you my cell phone number. My cell phone number is right here, 414-559-1528. I'm your resident futurist for the next little while. And if you have questions about the future, first of all, let me just say, I do not know if your team is going to win the finals in anything. I'm not that kind of a futurist. But I will take your questions about the future, as many as we have time for, before I end with my closing story. So take a picture of this, put it in your phone, do whatever you want. I'm always available to you. If you text me after today, would you please identify yourself? Because otherwise my phone thinks you're spam, and that's just weird. Okay, so 3 acts for this show today. Yesterday, today, tomorrow. But the truth is, I'm going to cram today and tomorrow into the 2nd act, and then I'm going to share a love letter with you for the 3rd act. So 3 acts. Ready? All right, let's go. First of all, Kit nailed it. This is such an important year. It's our 100th anniversary of suffrage. And when we think about women and the movement in the past, I hope we are thinking about the suffrage movement. I hope that's true for us, right? One of the things that is not well known, I want to take this look back at the women's movement over the last 100 years because, in 100 years' time, there are telling and retelling, and there are things that become truth that aren't really truth. And I've given this talk, this is actually my 3rd time giving a talk about the last 100 years in the last while, and I keep getting smarter and smarter as I dig in farther and farther. And one of the things that you may not know is that in its very earliest days, the women's movement for suffrage, for the right to vote, was very closely tied to the abolition movement, to the end of slavery. So these two things were very connected. And, that makes sense to me, because this is about freedom, and it's also about rights. It's It's about freedom and it's about rights. But there are a couple of kind of untidy truths about the women's movement as well. And one of the untidy truths is, this is Lucy Stone on the left and Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the right. And eventually these two women who ran two different women's movements for suffrage, eventually their movements merged. But let me tell you what the difference was and why this is kind of we tell ourselves an untidy truth about 100 years of women's suffrage. Lucy Stone was truly, truly an abolitionist, and so was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. There's no doubt about it. But in order to advance women's right to vote, they parted ways and said, well, accept African American women's rights to vote. This is an untidy truth. We don't like to tell this, but the suffrage movement was largely about white women's suffrage. And I think for us to move on as a country, we need to, number one, acknowledge that, and number two, we need to do better. We need to do better. Because as one are free, all are free, right? As one have rights, all have rights. If you've been spending any amount of time with me over the last 15 months in this region, you know that I often say we are not one and we are not two. We are not one and we are not two. So let this first lesson from the history of suffrage be a reminder to us of what suffrage really was and the work that there is yet to do. Because there were a whole group of Black suffragists who got eliminated from this dialogue and were left in large part to make their own fight, to continue to do their own work. My remote is not wanting to cooperate today, so I'll stand here and I'll woman it. See what I did there? Okay. Another great lesson from the suffrage movement is that England did it first. England did it first. And we watched what they did and what they didn't do and how they got it done, and we just borrowed from it, right? So this next bit is a collection of posters from the suffrage movement in England, and we borrowed from this wholesale. So now, you greedy boys, I shall not give you any more until I have helped myself. And so the political help had been given to labor, it had been given to all manner of people, and women now were saying, it's time for me to help myself. Women talked about how they, in being denied suffrage, were being lumped in with convicts and lunatics, right? People who also didn't have the right to vote. So the idea of not only who are we allying with, but who are we being grouped into in this greater dialogue? Another interesting thing about the suffrage movement and how we reached the tipping point with it is that there were a couple of actresses who were in true form, in the 1800s. They were actresses that all women wanted to be and all men wanted to be with. And when those actresses came out and started to talk about suffrage as a human rights issue, suffrage is something that, of course, we all naturally would want, it helped women, everyday women, understand, okay, if they can talk about it, I can talk about it. Didn't we just see the same thing in the Me Too movement, right? If they can talk about it, I can talk about it, right? Here's another thing we borrowed from suffrage was our strong alliance with labor, with the labor movement, right? Okay, hey, the league is saying, woo, woo, awesome. Votes for workers are votes for women, or votes for women are votes for workers, as women were doing the same work as men, often in worse conditions. And then finally, this is interesting, in the UK, the law was, and it was the same here, again, this was a borrowed contrivance, but the law was that if your husband died, whatever he had set into his will was the rule of the land, and you as a wife and your children as heirs had no rights whatsoever. So if you were widowed, and many women were, you immediately became a single parent, and there were no pensions that would be due to you. There was nothing in your husband's estate that would necessarily have to pass to you and your heirs. So this is an example of appropriation, really. We took these lessons learned from England and we started to put them into our own movement. And I think this is something that's important for us to remember now, because America, in many ways, has a sense of exceptionalism. And we think if it hasn't been invented here, we don't need to go anywhere else. We'll figure it out on our own by God, because we're chosen, and we'll just figure it out. But there are things happening around the world that we can learn from how the women's movement has progressed in other parts of the world. For one example being how 11, maybe now up to 13 countries have secured rights for the earth rights, that the earth should have rights. And these movements have largely been driven by women. When you think about what happened with the Women's March in the United States a couple years ago, some of you were there with your pink hats and whatnot, right? What you saw was scientists and people of color and workers and immigrants all taking up hands together. And this is the way movements happen, through alliance. But I want to tell you about one other alliance that we don't often talk about when we talk about the women's movement. And that is, I'm going to step up to this microphone, John, so I don't want to make anybody's ears bleed. Roger, thank you. One other alliance was the League of Men. There was no allied group to the women's movement, the suffrage movement, that took it harder than men did. I want to read to you the words of one incredibly inspiring man, Frederick Douglass. He was one of the 32 men, only 32 men, who signed the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848 in Seneca Falls. And later he spoke, 4 years later, he spoke at a women's conference. And I want to take an excerpt from his speech. "I do not feel like taking up more than a very small space of your time and attention, and shall not. I would not even now presume to speak, but for the circumstance of my early connection with the cause, and of having been called upon to do so by one whose voice in this council we all gladly obey." He's talking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton there. She was undeniable and a very strong force. "Men have very little business here as speakers anyhow. Woman knows, and she is her own best representative. We can neither speak for her, nor vote for her, nor act for her, nor be responsible for her. And the thing for men to do in the premises is just to get out of her way and give her the fullest opportunity to exercise all the powers inherent in her individual personality, and allow her to do as she herself shall elect to exercise them. Her right to be and to do is as full, complete, and perfect as the right of any man on earth." You can see why this man was so valuable and cherished in our own women's movement. So the lessons from our 100-year-ago march are lessons of alliances, how we align with each other. It is an exercise of coming up together, of aligning workers' rights with women's rights, with the rights of people of color, and so forth. And it's also an exercise in persistence, because, it took a while. 1848 was the first convention at Seneca Falls, and we are just now celebrating our 100th anniversary of suffrage. And it's especially the story of persistence in North Carolina, right? Because it wasn't until the early 70s that we passed suffrage here, right, for all women. So it's a story of persistence. So as we think about our next 100 years and so forth, let's steel ourselves for this ongoing challenge. I mean, let's pass it, but let's steel ourselves that the work is not done. So I'd like to talk a little bit about today and tomorrow. So now I'm taking off my historian hat, putting on my futurist hat. In your own heart, I'd like you to answer this question. I won't ask for a show of hands. But if you think about the future of women, women at work, women in society, how women are treated, women's experience, there's probably a spectrum from fearful about the future to hopeful about the future, right? Fearful to hopeful. So I want you to just think about placing yourself. Where do you place yourself on that spectrum? Are you hopeful, really hopeful? Are you fearful, very fearful? Where are you on that spectrum? There are reasons for all of those sentiments as we think and move forward. But as a futurist, I have a special way that I do this, right? The first thing to remind you of here is how many women are already in power. These are the new CEOs just since I started working with you last September. CEOs of some of the largest organizations. And I hope what you're noticing is that half of these photos are of women, right? 50% of them were speakers on this stage today, right? And this is just the people who have been recently appointed, recently promoted. Then you think about throughout this, just look at this audience. This is an incredible showing of women in leadership who are doing for themselves, who are leading organizations. Nobody has mentioned yet that Kit Kramer just led the Chamber of the Year. She was awarded internationally the Chamber of the Year. What is happening here in Western North Carolina is fantastic. But it's also not unique. The truth is we are living in a moment that was set in time 100 years ago. In 1972 by Title IX, 47 years ago, right? Through the 1950s and the 1960s, through the Cultural Revolution and the Civil Rights Revolution and the Women's Rights Movement, right? So now we have inherited a moment where this is happening. Where this is happening. But we can't forget that we're inheriting this moment because our foremothers and our forefathers helped put it in place. The thing we have to remember about the suffrage movement is that for suffrage to pass in those 38 states, right, back in the early 1900s, who was voting? Men were voting. Men had to vote for women's suffrage. Right? So we are inheriting the choices of our great-grandfathers and our great-grandmothers as we stand in this moment today. So the choices that we make today will create the causes and the conditions for what our children and their children inherit tomorrow. And when I think about the future, of course, as a futurist, I've got this little, you've heard me talk about it before, this little STEEP acronym that I use when I think about what the future will be. So when I think about the future for women, I think about the changes that are being made socially, right? The fact that as we talk about equal rights and equal pay, we also have to talk about how we take time off from work when we have kids. Should that be, something special that some people are allowed to do, or should everybody be allowed to do that? We have to look at how technology is changing the role, economy, environment, politics. So I pulled out just a few things for you here. First one is this. Female founders of startups, many of these in technology, are outperforming their male peers. Now, as an economist, this is incredibly important to me because if you really want to understand a system, a capitalist system, you follow the money. You follow the money. And what VCs and angel investors are finding is that when they follow the money, the smarter money is on women. Right? Women founders and women co-founders who are a little more efficient with their money, who tend to create more value in the marketplace with their money, and so on and so forth. You also notice this. Now, I know that this has got a lot of data on it, but I want to point out a couple things. Now, this covers some society and economic trends. Compared to men, more millennial women have, upper left-hand corner, a steady job. Now, the second one is one I really want you to focus on, especially if you own a millennial. They've moved out of their parents' house. Right? A few more men than women have bought homes, lease or own a car, have the means to afford a child, paid off their student loans, built some investment savings, have their own insurance coverage, are managing their own taxes, and earn more than their parents. If you want to know what the future of women is, let's look at the future of our millennials, right? Our 20-something and our early 30-somethings, who, compared to young men, right, are doing fantastically. So for those of you who are parents of millennials, I wanna thank you. But then another statistic, right? Now this is the entire freshman class from the midterm elections. But if you look just at the number of women and the number of minorities, our body politic is changing, right? And again, one of the things to know is governance and politics are often the last to change. Technology changes quickly. The economy can change rather rapidly, but demographics are kind of a drip, drip, drip change, and so are politics, right? So when you start to see this many women, this many people of color serving in some of our highest offices in the federal government, what we can say is we're on a trajectory where more of this is going to be more in the future. But if we really want to get a sense for tomorrow, we have to look at girls today. If we look at girls today, because of course they're going to be our women of tomorrow, I want to spend just a moment talking about this rock star. I don't even know where to start with this. Greta Thunberg, Swedish teenager now, who actually is on the autism spectrum. And she credits this with the reason she raised her voice in the first place. Over a year ago, maybe almost 2 years ago now, she started to lead walkouts at her school on behalf of the environment. And this became a movement where 1.5 million kids were walking out of their schools on a regular basis because of what was happening in the environment. And when Greta talks about her autism, she says this. She credits her autism and her she is not neurotypical, so she tends to see things in black and white, right? And that is what she said called her to this moment. She said, I couldn't believe that we were facing an existential crisis. And now hear this from the mouth of a child. We were facing an existential crisis, and the adults weren't doing anything about it. That is why she, as a child, stepped up, because she didn't see her parents, the adults, the authority figures in her life, doing anything about it. And what's interesting, there's a lot about this that's interesting. I mean, there's the fact that she's a young girl. There's the fact that she's on the spectrum. There are all kinds of things that are kind of layered in this. But I feel like what we as women, one of the things that we have a special, I do think this is a unique trait to our gender, is to listen to our children. It's to listen to our children out of the mouths of babes, right? So when you think about this next generation of activists, this next generation of social change makers, the women who've been awarded here today, this will be a long and lengthening impact. What does some of the data say? This is something that may surprise you. The data is showing that girls actually get better grades in STEM than boys do, by 6.3% on average. So that's the difference between being an A- and an A+, if you're within the mean and the median, or a B+ and an A-. Between 6th grade and college, that's what this study included, girls outperform boys in STEM subjects. So what does that say for the future of STEM and STEM sciences, and how, maybe at some point, right, we will do more than invent Viagra drugs, Some of our great scientific, we have 2. I mean, wow, it's great. So how do these great scientific minds get applied in a different way? And how will young women and men do this? Finally, I don't know if you saw this, but Scotland actually sort of declared a state of emergency around this, that there were so many more women than men enrolled in university that they had to do something about it, right? Something needed to be done about this. One of my teachers, one of my Zen teachers, Ken Kushner, he turned 70 last year. I only mention that so that you can place him in the generational spectrum. And we were chit-chatting the other day, and I was telling him that I was doing these talks about the future of women. He was like, holy cow. He said, in my lifetime. He said, in my lifetime, in my MD program, there were 5 women in my class, and he had hundreds in his class for MDs. And he said, now when I teach, he teaches in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Wisconsin. He said, when I teach, it's almost all women, well more than half. So we know that in our law programs and our doctors, in our programs to train doctors, in most of the professions, we have more women than men graduating with these degrees. So you play that forward, right? More of this. More of this. We're on a lovely trajectory. There's one other thing I want to share with you, and this is somewhat new research, but it's fascinating to me, and it goes back to what I said earlier about if you want to understand a capitalist country, economy, you follow the what? Follow the money. When Wall Street went through its own existential crisis, the mortgage meltdown and all that, we all saw it, our own 401ks and IRAs took a big dive. People were scrambling, trying to figure out how the heck am I going to make this up? So Wall Street went looking for places that money could be invested that would out-earn the market and so forth. And you saw the stat about female founders, but I want to talk to you about a little something in the public sector. The Criterion Institute has been doing a lot of research on what they call gender lens investing, right? Can you take a gender lens to some of our investments? And what they found in early research that included Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, they looked at the bond ratings of municipalities and counties, so cities and counties, that were run by male executives versus female executives. And what they found was female executives who were running public sector, organizations, so Deborah Averill, out-earned they had higher bond ratings than those cities that were run by men. So once again, if you follow the money, even in the public sector, we know that there is a true female advantage in all of this, a true female advantage. So another little foresight tool that I use is this notion of what is the future, right? Futures, when we design futures, we did futures for you guys here, we know that there's the expectable future in blue, the things that we would just expect to be true, that's kind of the business as usual. Then there's the zone of growing desperation down in red, kind of the ouchy, icky, uh-oh future, right? And then there's the zone of high aspiration. And if you're only looking at the data, if you're only looking at the numbers, the percentages of women in schools, some of the things we talked about, STEM grades and so on, the future of women, if I were betting money, is up here, right? It is up here in the visionary, in the surprising area, right? That women will continue to rise, just follow the trajectory of our girls. Now, I know that for some of you on that fear to hope spectrum, you're like, the reason I'm fearful is because of backlash. The reason I'm fearful is because of isms. The reason I'm fearful is because of othering, because of some of the, the rhetoric that doesn't feel safe and so forth. History isn't linear. We lurch. We lurch like a paddle wheel. And, in the sciences, we know that if you start to turn the heat on underneath water, the temperature is already 212 degrees before you start to see the bubbles rolling. That's true. The temperature is already 212 degrees before you start to see the bubbles. That's called phase change. And when you look at how we've set up our young women and our young girls and the work that you're putting into our next generation, I think what you're going to start to see is some lurching, some true phase change. All right, let me ask you, what should we be talking about? What should we be talking about? All right, first question. What advice would you give to an 18-year-old young woman, freshman in college, going into a biomedical field? I'd be interested in your feedback on this as well. I would say if there isn't already, she should start a Woman in the Sciences meetup group, because she's going to need and want to be with her sisters, right? The other thing I would say is read broadly beyond the sciences. Because when you think about the true challenges facing our world right now, they require an interdisciplinary approach, right? It's one of the things we learned through Asheville Greater, right? Was this idea that it's not just the chamber's job to work on things related to the economy, but we have to start to do that in a very intersectional way. Next question. Do you think we'll have a woman president? Yes. Yes, I do. I gotta take just a second. Last week, I was with a bunch of straight up government nerds, like people who study government, who profess about government, who serve in government, who are elected in government, true government nerds. And I did this Q&A part, and my favorite question was this one. I assume it was a woman, I don't know for sure. The person texted me and said, Rebecca, a few years ago I met you at an ICMA conference, International City County Managers Association conference, and I asked you whether a gay village manager would ever be fully accepted within their village. You know, a village is a very tiny local unit of government. You said absolutely. Then I asked you if we would ever have a gay candidate running for presidential office. And you said, yes, in my lifetime we will. The person wrote, I thought you were nuts. The question I have for you, she said, is, do you have any lottery recommendation numbers? Reproductive rights as backlash. How do we most successfully combat? I think this comes down to alliances. It comes down to storytelling, right? And, political pressure. So, I mean, I'm not naive. I know that the game has changed. But it's not smarter than we are. You know how to make kids eat vegetables, you know? You know how to get your spouses to dance while taking out the trash, right? These issues are not smarter than we are, but we also have to be willing to abandon techniques and tactics that no longer work, right? What does a march look like for the millennial generation? I still believe that doing things in flesh and bones, where we can look and see each other in the eyes, these are timeless. Human beings have the need to do this. This is why we love coming together for events like these, right? But there's also more that we could be doing. So don't be trapped in what we've always done, but let us think about alliances and let us think about new ways of political pressure. And let's also just not forget that we have demographics on our side. How do we get GOP-controlled states to vote for the bill? Well, every state is different. So I don't know that I have an across-the-board response to this, but what I will say, and this is actually something we learned from the suffrage movement, is feds change last. States are always the laboratories, right? So when California and the state of Washington or even King County say, we're gonna do a $15 minimum wage, right, as an example, that's not federal law. People are innovating that at the local level, at the state level. So let North Carolina be your laboratory, right? And there are issues. One of the things I found as a futurist is no political party has a lock on the future. They don't know exactly what it's going to be. So the future is one of those places that can help bring people together. I just got this question about men. I'm going to leave that for just a second because it's part of my closing story. Wow, you guys are lighting me up right now. Anything that I don't answer here, I promise I will answer afterwards. What are your thoughts on the tech industry in Western North Carolina? Do you think we have a different perspective of value than out west? God, I hope so. Honest to God, I hope so. One of the things I think a lot about is the distraction economy. The Stanford Persuasion Lab, which is where so many of our app developers and founders were trained, how to get your eyeball on their page and keep it there, right? App developers have told me that they feel today like bankers must have felt like during the banking crisis, that app developers are the scourge of America. You know, working for Facebook, even working for Google now is not the value proposition that it once was. So people talk a lot about human-centered design. What about humane-centered design? Women have historically not talked about money. Do you see that changing? Well, Deborah Campbell did a good job today talking about it. And by the way, I want to give your sister the biggest, wettest kiss on her forehead. You know, I want to give the big, wet kisses to so many people who brought you to this moment. You know who they are. In a very singular way, you know who they are. One of my challenges for you is on your drive out of here, you're going to be jammed up in traffic for a minute. Call somebody who you can still get in touch with and thank them. Thank them. Every one of us has a Deborah Campbell's big sister. I want to close with a couple thoughts here. You might think that my job as a futurist is to think about steep trends and figure out plausible futures and work on projects like Asheville Greater, and you would be right. On the surface, that is my job. But I actually think that my job is about two things. You know what, and I told this first. Is Kathy Ball in the audience today? Kathy, are you here? No? I told this first to Kathy Ball almost a year ago when we were talking about the future of the city. And I said, you know, I feel like my first job as a futurist is to reduce people's fear. It's just bring the fear level down. Because when we are in fear, we are not our best selves. I want to give you an example of this. Mother Teresa would never walk in a march that was anti-war, ever. But she would march for peace. Right? When I look at the state of activism today, there is so much fear and anger. The things we say about people and to people. That's why I'm talking about a movement for humanity, right? It comes out of fear, though. It comes out of fear. So I want you to think about how you, in your own life, can help reduce fear. How can you help reduce fear? Sometimes it's just about being present, being fully present. Sometimes it's just about taking a long, deep breath. Sometimes it's about calling the question. Kit called the question a year ago. She said, who does this region want to become? That was a question that needed to be called, right? There are a lot of ways to reduce fear, but I think that's job number one, because we are in an environment right now where people are just afraid. Right? Therapy practices have changed drastically, right? People's PTSD has been touched in many different areas. How, by your presence, can you help dispel fear in a situation? And then I think our other job as humans is to increase our sense of connection. But this is not easy to do. I mean, as a futurist, what I try to do is help you understand that the choices you make today are choices that your kids and grandkids are going to inherit. That helps connect people across generations. It helps you to know that you're sitting at this table today because of a million different choices that were made by you and others along your way. Why are you at this table and not at a different table? Right? Because of choices, because of things that our parents and grandparents and we ourselves and our mentors did or didn't do. Read anybody's biography, and you will see that over and over and over again, right? So how do we connect? But we have become really unskillful in this. I think, as Tristan Harris says, we are in a race to the bottom of the brainstem right now. And again, it is not taking us where we need to go. I'm going to give you one example, and I have a lot of respect for Hannah Rosen. But this article came out in Atlantic Magazine several years ago, and I thought, well, holy shit. You know, gee, birds. And then she wrote a book about the same thing. And she made she's a very good historian. And she made some very interesting arguments in this book. But the title will stop us in our tracks. And here's where I want to close with this today. You can be for women without being against men. And I think that's what we mean when we talk about equality. Likewise, you can support police. You can say that blue lives matter, and you can say that black lives matter. Right? But this is not a sophisticated argument. This is a very unsophisticated argument. It plays into this binary of either or, right? Why? And we love binaries. We love to feel like the good guys, but in order for us to feel like the good guys, somebody else has to be the bad guy, right? That's bullshit. It's bullshit. So as you leave here today, I'm going to challenge you to stop your othering. That it's a 0 or it's a 1. It's a yes or it's a no, right? As humans, one of our beautiful endowments is our ability to think critically, to ask questions, to remain curious, right? So to not get trapped into this, and if you want a bonus point on this, for years and years, I've gone to gay pride parades because I am gay. My wife is here, my sister-in-law is here today. And the group that always gets the loudest applause at the gay pride parade are PFLAG members, parents and friends of lesbians and gays. Why do they get the loudest applause? Because they are sticking their necks out. They are walking with a sign down Main Street in their own communities saying that they support their gay or queer or transgendered or non-binary son or daughter, right? So if we want to get beyond this 0-1, you're for women and you're against men, how can we be both? If you want to get past that binary, start there, but then ask, who can you be for? Who can you be for? How can you be that PFLAG marcher in someone else's parade, right? Because we need each other. And good news, we have each other. Thank you.